Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Uncharted: The Lost Legacy for PlayStation 4. This is a third-person shooter and action-adventure game developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony in August of this year exclusively for PlayStation 4. It is the follow-up to Uncharted 4, although it does not feature Nathan Drake. Instead, they have you take on the role of Chloe Fraser as she goes off on an adventure in India after the events of Uncharted 4. Now, it is worth noting that this game was also released at a lower price point than its predecessors. Instead of the $60 retail release that we saw from the previous Uncharted games, this one was a $40 release, and it also includes access to the multiplayer component of Uncharted 4. Meaning that the multiplayer component is pretty much tacked on here. All of the original content and all the effort seems to be put into the single-player campaign, which of course brings up the question of how it is. Well, as far as general reception upon release goes, most people seem to enjoy it quite a bit. It got pretty good reviews across the board, although it didn't get quite as good reviews as its predecessors. So let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and find out what exactly happened here, and why it may not have been as well received as its predecessors. Well, as far as presentation goes, it is exactly on the same level as Uncharted 4, which means that it's a very good-looking game across the board. The modeling is excellent, the texture quality for a PS4 game is very high, and you've got a lot of attention to detail in the environments, as well as the various character outfits and things like that really does make this thing shine. And let's be fair here, Naughty Dog has developed a reputation for an excessive amount of polish in their games, so that's pretty much what we expected from this. About the only major complaint I can raise about the visuals is more of a nitpick than anything else, and that's that the lip syncing isn't always on point. Whenever you're in a major cutscene, it looks fantastic, but when you go into the normal gameplay and you actually turn the characters to look at their faces while they're talking, it's more of the old style of lip sync, where their mouths are moving but they're not matching exactly what they're saying. It's the kind of thing that just feels really out of place, because the rest of the game is superbly polished as far as its visuals go, and then you get to that and it looks just downright awful. But the thing is, in those instances, the character is usually not turned towards you while you're talking, so you just won't notice it unless you're paying attention. Hence me saying that it's more of a nitpick than anything else, because if the character's not turned towards you while they're talking, then you're not even going to notice it. The one thing you are probably going to notice all the time is the sound design, however, which generally is very well done. Once again, the voice acting is absolutely brilliant in this game. Like in all of the previous Uncharted games, they have done a fantastic job with the cast and the direction. All the actors play their roles extremely well. There's quite a bit of humor in the game, and it ends up working very well because the actors do a good job with it. And everything does have this sense of personality to it that you would come to expect from the Uncharted series by this point. It's really one of the strongest traits the series has, and it's good to see that even on the sort of spin-off games, they don't skimp on that. What's not as strong are the sound effects and the music. Now, that's not to say that they're bad or anything, it's just that they're really not all that remarkable. The music is the sort of orchestral action-adventure music we've come to expect from the Uncharted series, and it just kind of blends into the background and you barely notice it for the most part. When you do notice it, you'd notice that it does have some Indian influences in it, so at least they did tailor it to the setting and made it actually make sense. But at the same time, you're not really going to be able to remember any of the tracks in this game outside of the confines of the game. Then you move over into sound effects, and a lot of those were just ripped directly from Uncharted 4. Now, they were certainly decent enough in Uncharted 4 that they weren't really a problem, but I would still like more bass. I need more beef in my gun and explosion sounds than what they have on offer here. That's not to say that they're weak or anything. I mean, they do have a decent amount of punch to them, but they're still just not the kind of hard-hitting sound effects that are really great for gun and explosion sounds. Everything else generally sounds fine. I mean, you got decent enough environmental sound effects that end up sounding relatively realistic. You've got, of course, the sound effects of the ambience, and that all works very well. It's just that the gun and explosion sounds need more beef to them, and it's a bit of a shame that they weren't able to improve upon that with Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. But when you bring everything together, the game is more or less comparable in presentation to Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. It's pretty much the same exact engine from what I can tell. It may have been optimized a bit more, they may have been able to squeeze a bit more out of it, but by and large, it looks pretty much the same graphically. It just takes place in different locales, even though some of those locales are pretty much the same kind of stuff we saw in Uncharted 4 to begin with, namely jungle environments. But let's face it, when you get down to it, it's all about the story and the gameplay, and presentation is just some icing on the cake. And as far as the story goes here, like I said before, you do play as Chloe Fraser, a character from the previous Uncharted games, and she is going on an adventure into India with the help of Nadine Ross, a character from Uncharted 4. And they're working together to find the Tusk of Ganesh. It's an artifact from Hindu mythology where the Hindu god Shiva supposedly cut off this tusk from the Hindu god Ganesh. Now, admittedly, I don't know much about Hindu mythology, so I can't really confirm how accurate this is to Hindu mythology as far as the backstory of the tusk goes, but at least as far as the confines of the game go, it was an artifact that supposedly the Hoysala Empire had, and after they fell, it was lost. Now, of course, finding the tusk is no easy task, considering that they have to deal with all of the machinations of the Hoysala Empire, among other things, but they also are in a war-torn India. There's a group of insurgents led by a guy named Asav who are also after the tusk, and he serves as the primary antagonist throughout the entire game. And sadly enough, he ends up being pretty much the weakest character in the game. You get the idea that they're trying to portray him as this sort of menacing foe who is a lot smarter than he lets on and is incredibly good at manipulating things. But when you get down to it, he's really just kind of a cartoonish villain. And while you do want to whoop his ass by the end of the game, it's not because he's actually any sort of menacing villain, it's just because he's really annoying. This means that while he does serve the role of the antagonist, ultimately he's really just not all that compelling a character. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because for the most part he's kind of a background character. He only comes in when the plot demands it, and that's why he's so annoying. Because you'd much rather be focusing on what Chloe and Nadine are doing and how their working relationship goes along the course of the game. That's really the interesting part of the story, because this is actually kind of a personal thing for Chloe, and I'm not going to spoil why it's a personal thing for her, but much like how the search for Avery's treasure in Uncharted 4 is a very personal thing for Nathan, the adventure being more of a personal thing for Chloe actually makes this more interesting in the long run, because Chloe didn't really have all that much backstory in the previous games to begin with, so it's good to learn more about her and what makes her tick. It also provides more opportunity for character growth in her regard, and that is something that the game handles relatively well. Similar things happen with the character of Nadine Ross. She is someone who was introduced in Uncharted 4 but didn't really have all that much backstory to her other than she was the leader of Shoreline, and despite that she still ended up being a relatively decent character in Uncharted 4, although she didn't really have all that much opportunity to shine. Now she does have a lot more opportunity to shine, and it ends up working out pretty well in the game's favor. Because in the previous game, she was just an antagonist, and she behaved as such, and the story treated her as such. But when you get to the Lost Legacy, it does go a bit more into her backstory, it goes a bit more into how she actually is as a person, versus what you saw of her in the previous game. And the dynamic between Chloe and Nadine actually ends up driving the game forward quite a bit. It's one of the main factors that you'll be interested in throughout the course of the game, and you'll want to see how it progresses. The fact that they're looking for treasure is almost a tertiary concern, certainly a secondary one, and that ends up being something that actually ends up working in the game's favor, because the story of the Tusk and how you actually find the Tusk is really one of the weaker elements of the game. Unlike the previous game, there's really not a lot of twists and turns here. It's a fairly straightforward plot, and thus the character moments are really what are going to drive you forward with it. So it ends up being kind of typical of the Uncharted series, where the character moments are really what are going to make you want to keep playing the game, and everything else just kind of falls into place beyond that. Either it's something that just works, or it's something that isn't particularly strong. Case in point, the gameplay, which is basically unchanged from Uncharted 4 from a raw mechanical standpoint, except for the addition of a lockpicking mechanic. And all the lockpicking mechanic is simply holding the left stick in one particular spot while the controller is vibrating in order to have the tumbler set into place. And once you've done that, then you move on to the next tumbler and just rotate the stick around until you find the sweet spot, and eventually it will hold into place and you'll open whatever it is you're trying to open. And while the lockpicking idea certainly fits Chloe's character quite well, unfortunately it's mechanically very simplistic and ultimately very boring. Luckily, the game doesn't really push it on you that much, and when you actually go in to do the lockpicking mechanic itself, it doesn't take more than a few seconds anyway, so it doesn't really overstay its welcome. But when you get beyond that shiny new lockpicking mechanic, you end up with just the same exact gameplay that you saw in Uncharted 4. You scramble along the various platforms, you do a lot of jumping, you swing on a grappling hook, you climb up things, you have a pick that you can stick into the wall in order to anchor yourself in order to jump to something else. You still have extremely bare-bones third-person cover-based shooting mechanics, where you have one slot for a sidearm, that being your pistols and such, and one slot for a primary weapon, whether that be a shotgun or a rifle or something like that. And like in Uncharted 4, headshots are the way to go with that because they drop enemies very quickly and easily. Although some characters are armored and you'll need to chip away at their armor before you can actually do any real damage to them. And some other enemies you are only allowed to take out in one specific way, and that involves cutscenes, because, you know, it's a cinematic action-adventure game, they've gotta have those kind of things in there. To which I have to say, let us play the damn game, don't force us into cool action set pieces that are really unnecessary. Like the scene where you have to take out a helicopter, not by shooting it down with RPGs or whatever, but instead by hooking onto it with a grappling hook after you've damaged it, climbing up the grappling hook, climbing into the helicopter, and then crashing it. It literally will not let you progress unless you use the grappling hook. If you choose to try to shoot it down even more, then the additional rockets just won't do anything to it. It's really annoying. Thankfully, moments like that are very few and far between in this game, and it actually does give you more options this time around as well. In the previous game, they had more emphasis on stealth mechanics, which in this are very rudimentary. You're either in the tall grass and thus you're kind of hidden, or you're behind something and enemies don't see you, or enemies spot you and all hell breaks loose. Mechanically, it's pretty much identical to Uncharted 4 in that regard, but they did introduce a few suppressed weapons that allow you to take out enemies quietly from a distance, as opposed to having to sneak up on them from behind and then just take them down. Although ammunition for those suppressed weapons is extremely scarce, so you still have to be careful with it. But what else is on offer here? Well, there are some puzzles, but unfortunately the game relies far too much on these types of puzzles that are very similar to sliding block puzzles, where you have an image displayed in various rings, and you have to select the different rings in order to rotate them, and they all rotate in different directions, and with different ring combinations, ultimately meaning that it's just a very tedious trial and error kind of thing. Now ultimately that's how I could describe just about any puzzle in the entire Uncharted series, just trial and error, but this game just relies way too much on the ring image puzzles, and that ends up just becoming extremely boring by the end of the game. Now luckily those aren't the only puzzles in the game, but the other puzzles are very simplistic as well, and they don't last very long. But more importantly, they mostly involve the platforming, which means that they also wear thin pretty quickly and are pretty obvious on how to solve them. So one thing they definitely needed a lot more of was variety in the puzzles, and some that actually required you to use your brain more than simply just doing things over and over again until eventually it works. And in general, the game could have also used a bit more differentiation from Uncharted 4, because instead of feeling like a full-on sequel or anything like that, it feels more like this could have just been DLC for Uncharted 4. Especially considering that the multiplayer component is quite literally just Uncharted 4's multiplayer, but you're given access to the DLC code that unlocks all of the base game content. Well, at least with a brand new retail copy of the game, I mean. And quite frankly, if you want to know how the multiplayer in Uncharted 4 works, just watch my Uncharted 4 review, because I go over it in fair detail there. And since I've already gone over it, and it was the multiplayer component from a different game, I don't really feel the need to go over it again here. And when you bring everything together and you realize that this may as well have been a DLC for Uncharted 4, it really does become obvious why this wasn't as well received as the previous games in the series. The storyline is shorter than all of the previous Uncharted games. It's going to clock in at around 5 to 7 hours long depending on what difficulty you're playing on, as well as other factors. And once you've completed the storyline, there's really not much else to this particular game. I mean, it's got a multiplayer component from a previous game, and if you didn't like the multiplayer in that, then you're certainly not going to like it here. And that really brings up something that's very important to understand with Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. Its appeal is going to be very limited if you weren't already a fan of the Uncharted series. Now, you gotta keep in mind, I've played all 4 of the previous games in the series. I have 4 games of backstory leading up to this. I know who all of the characters are, except for the people they introduced brand new in this particular game. And seeing those particular characters expanded on, and seeing how their personality shifts a bit when they're in the driving roles as opposed to just being side characters, is really what made this game pop. If I hadn't already played all 4 of the previous games, I would have a much more limited scope on who these characters are, why they're doing, what all of their backstories are, and of course all these different things that they reference throughout the game that happened in previous games. It would have ultimately made the game a hell of a lot less enjoyable as a result, and I feel like that's the big problem with this thing. It's arguably the most unremarkable title in the entire Uncharted series. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, it's actually a pretty decent game. It's just that it's not really going to be the kind of thing that's going to win you over to the series if you weren't already a fan of it. And if you're already a fan of the Uncharted series, then you know you're going to enjoy it. Which ultimately leads me to my main conclusion. I'm giving this a 3 out of 5, with the stipulation that you really do need to have played the previous games in the series or be a fan of the previous games in the series in order to really get the most out of this. And even if you have already played the previous games in the series, and especially if you like them, then I would still say you may want to wait for this to go on sale in order to pick it up. Because $40 for what you get here is still a bit pricey. They really should have just released this as either a single-player DLC for Uncharted 4, or released it at a more reduced price and then just not put in the multiplayer component. I feel like that just would have worked out better in the long run. Thanks for watching.